My son calls me a burden. He tells the courts my gnarled hands are a sign I can't care for myself, all while he loots my estate. For Thanksgiving, he sent chocolates to my secluded ranch. When the box spilled, I didn't just find truffles, I found a hard plastic tracker hidden inside. The betrayal stung more than the fire in my joints. I'm 60, not stupid. I've already hidden a recorder behind the decanters in the bar. Kevin wants to play shark. He has no idea what's coming. Listen to the end to hear how I handled it, and subscribe to hear more of my journey. The gold-foiled box hit the saltilla tile with a hollow thud, and something in me shattered along with it. Not my pride, that's a different kind of break, slower, quieter. What shattered was the last fragile pretense I'd been carrying since the conservatorship papers arrived last spring, the pretense that my son still saw me as a person. I knelt. My knees popped like dry kindling snapping over a fire, each joint announcing its displeasure in the particular way that arthritis has, not a clean crack but a grinding complaint, a biological protest that Kevin's lawyers had somehow parlayed into evidence of incompetence. The truffles had scattered across the saltilla in a loose arc, some still in their fluted paper cups, others rolling toward the base of the entryway cabinet. I gathered them one by one, my gnarled fingers working with the careful deliberateness of someone defusing a device. That's when my fingertips found it. Cold. Hard. The size of a large matchbox. Tucked beneath the molded plastic liner with the careful precision of someone who had done this before, or watched enough YouTube tutorials to feel confident. I peeled back the faux velvet tray. The tracker's status light blinked up at me in a steady, mocking green. A tiny eye that never blinked. A tiny eye that had been watching. Kevin isn't waiting for me to die. The thought arrived fully formed, clinical, the way the worst realizations always do. He's tracking the speed of the decay. I stayed kneeling on the tile for a moment longer than I needed to. The cold of the stone seeped through my linen trousers, and the 80% cacao truffle closest to my knee smelled dark and expensive, the kind of chocolate a guilty man buys because he can't afford emotion but can charge luxury to a credit card. The betrayal tasted more bitter than any of it. I knew exactly what it was before I'd fully registered what I was seeing. A Tile Pro. High-end model, the one with the extended Bluetooth range that can ping a network of millions of devices. I'd seen these tucked into the wheel wells of Mercedes-Benzes during the ugliest divorce settlements in Paradise Valley, wives who suspected, husbands who lied, money that needed to be found before it disappeared into offshore accounts. I'd seen investigators palm these things like a magic trick. 30 years in luxury real estate teaches you the shadow economy running beneath every transaction, the hidden clauses, the buried liens, the small hard truths concealed under soft packaging. My son, the struggling developer, was using the tools of my old trade against me. He wanted to know if I was wandering. If I was forgetting my way to the mailbox. If I'd finally deteriorated enough to justify upgrading me from the ranch to a facility with coded doors and scheduled medication windows and staff who speak in the bright, loud tones reserved for the elderly and the very young. He was monitoring my heartbeat through the floorboards of my own home. I didn't stand. I didn't move. I crouched there on the saltilla tile with a blinking green eye in my palm, and I stared at it until my vision blurred at the edges, until the light smeared into a long green streak, until the full architecture of what my son had constructed around me came into focus: the conservatorship, the asset freeze, the wellness checks he'd requested through the court, and now this. A surveillance device in a gift box, delivered on Thanksgiving Eve with a gold ribbon and a card that probably said "Love, Kevin." The desert doesn't lie. People do. Ma'am? The courier's voice came from the arched entryway. I need the signature. His shadow stretched long and impatient across the foyer tiles, reaching almost to where I was still kneeling. I heard the subtle shift of his weight, the particular restlessness of a young man with 12 more stops on his route and a dinner getting cold at home. I stood. Slowly. My joints issued their full complaint, a symphony of grinding discomfort that started in my knees and radiated upward through my hips. I smoothed my linen tunic with a trembling hand. The tremors had gotten worse in the last hour. They often did when my cortisol spiked, and I did not hurry. Hurrying is what people do when they feel guilty or afraid. I was neither. I didn't look at him as I took the electronic stylus. Eleanor Vance. I scratched it into the glass screen. The lines came out jagged, the signature of a woman whose hands were fighting her, and I felt the courier's gaze flick to my fingers with that particular quality of attention people give to things that disturb them. He was cataloging it. Another data point in the world's ongoing assessment of my competence. I handed the device back with the thin-lipped smirk I'd perfected in 20 years of closing rooms full of men who thought a woman in real estate was a novelty. He didn't say thank you. He just fled. I retreated to my sanctuary. The mahogany desk sat in the study like an anchor point for the room's entire gravitational field. I'd bought it at an estate auction in Scottsdale in 1997, outbidding a developer who'd wanted to flip the property it came from, and I'd loved it with the particular loyalty I reserve for things that have never failed me. It had survived 3 market recessions, the death of my husband, and Kevin's first attempt to help me organize my affairs 2 years ago. The wood was cool under my palms as I settled into the leather chair, and I pressed them flat against the surface and held them there, feeling the grain of it, the realness. Through the window behind me, the desert heat still radiated off the glass in waves, even as the sun began its slow descent toward the superstitions. My heart was doing something I didn't appreciate, hammering with the frantic percussion of a prey animal, a flicker I'd spent decades learning to read in other people and had hoped never to recognize in myself. I forced it down. I breathed in through my nose, parched earth, creosote, the ghost of cedar from the desk's old drawers. I breathed out. In this room, I was still the shark. I didn't need a lawyer yet. Lawyers were a closing move, and I hadn't finished the opening. I needed a strategy. The bottom right drawer had a hidden catch, a small brass lever set flush with the wood, invisible unless you knew where to press. My hands shook as I fumbled for it, the tremors working against me, but muscle memory is a different kind of intelligence than the conscious kind. It lives in the tendons and the fingertips, laid down over years of repetition until it becomes reflex. My finger found the lever. The drawer slid open on its old brass runners. The Olympus digital voice recorder sat in the back corner, exactly where I'd left it. A brick of silver plastic, a decade obsolete in a world of smartphones and cloud storage, but its microphone, a dual-directional condenser mic that the specs called studio quality, could catch a whispered lie from across a crowded ballroom. I'd used this recorder to capture every verbal agreement from Scottsdale to Sedona, handshake deals that later tried to become undealable, promises made over bourbon that buyers suddenly couldn't remember come morning. I'd built a career on documentation. If Kevin wanted a paper trail, I'd give him an audio one. I held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, heavier than it looked, heavier than anything that small should be. There was something almost ceremonial about holding it. The slide switch resisted my thumb. I pushed. The joint at the base of my thumb sent up a spike of white-hot protest, the kind of pain that lives right at the edge of what you can absorb without flinching. I absorbed it. My teeth came together. I pushed harder, and the switch gave with a stubbornness that felt almost personal, as though even the recorder was testing whether I still had what it took. The LCD screen flickered to life, a pale blue glow that cut through the study's dimness and lit up the dust motes floating in the warm air. Midnight. The batteries I'd swapped out last month, in one of those rare moments of foresight that probably read as paranoia until it reads as preparation, were at full capacity. I held the recorder close to my lips. Whispered, record. The red LED pulsed. Patient. Ready. I played it back. My voice came through the small speaker dry and husky, sandpaper and desert wind, but every syllable was clean and captured. No distortion. No dropout. 30 years of reading rooms had taught me the value of preparation. The trap was armed. I moved to the home bar, my leather loafers silent on the Turkish rugs. The bar sat against the east wall of the living room, flanked by a set of shelves I'd lined with crystal decanters. I'd collected them over the years: Waterford, Baccarat, a few vintage pieces I'd sourced through estate sales, and they caught the light beautifully, turning the afternoon sun into amber facets that scattered across the white walls. Beautiful and useful. The amber of the 12-year bourbon in the heaviest Baccarat decanter would refract and scatter any light source behind it, including the pale blue glow of an LCD screen. I chose my spot with the precision of a woman who had spent decades staging properties to conceal their flaws while highlighting their assets. The recorder slid behind the decanter, nestled against the back of the shelf, invisible from any angle except directly behind it. I angled the dual-directional mic toward the leather club chairs positioned 6 feet away. Kevin's chairs. He'd claimed them 2 years ago during his first intervention, spreading papers across the low table like a man marking territory, and he'd used them every visit since to deliver his reports on my declining condition, with the barely concealed impatience of a man waiting for an inheritance. The mic would catch the rustle of paper, the shallow, frantic breathing that gave his lies away before his mouth had finished telling them. The particular quality of silence a man produced when he thought he'd already won. I pressed record and stepped back. The spasm hit without warning. My right hand seized, fingers curling inward, claw-like and suddenly not mine, as a needle of white fire shot from my knuckles to my elbow in a single continuous arc. I gasped. The sound came out involuntary, the kind of sound I'd trained myself not to make in public, and I slammed my hip against the granite bar top hard enough to rattle the decanters. I did not fall. I grabbed my own wrist with my left hand and squeezed until the skin blanched, a trick my rheumatologist had given me, counter-pressure to interrupt the spasm's feedback loop, and I stood there in the amber-scented silence of my own living room, panting, hissing through my teeth at my own body. Not now. Give me 1 hour. Just 1 hour of competence. The joint pain ebbed by degrees. Not gone, it was never gone anymore, just redistributed, becoming the background radiation of my existence. But the acute spike receded. The smell of the bourbon helped. Parched earth through the window glass. The familiar architecture of my own home. I straightened. Fixed my hair with my functional hand. Rubbed my knuckles, the habitual gesture I'd never managed to break, and turned back toward the window. 300 acres of Sonoran desert spread out from the floor-to-ceiling glass in every direction, saguaro sentinels standing against a sky that was beginning to bruise toward violet at its western edge. My father had surveyed this land. I'd grown up watching him walk it, marking its boundaries with the particular reverence of a man who understood that land was the only thing they'd stopped making. Kevin wanted to liquidate it. I stood at the glass and scanned the horizon. The Superstition Mountains were already in shadow, their silhouettes going dark and absolute. No dust clouds on the northern approach, the gravel drive ran north, and a vehicle moving fast enough would raise a plume visible a quarter-mile out. No white BMW SUV. No headlights. The silence of the ranch pressed in from every direction. It was the silence I'd chosen when I bought this property over 2 decades ago. The particular quality of quiet you only found miles from the nearest neighbor, the kind of silence that meant no one was coming unless you called them. Kevin had counted on that. He'd made sure of it. I stood there until I was certain, and then I turned back to the room. My reflection caught me in the window glass, superimposed over the bruising sky, a woman 60 years old with a chin-length salt and pepper cut and gray eyes that could stop a room. I looked like a woman in control. I made sure of it. I relaxed my jaw, I'd been clenching it since the tracker hit my palm. I softened the set of my eyes, letting the steel gray go from reactive to observant, the shift from fight to read. I developed this face in conference rooms and closing tables, across from men who thought a handshake was a guarantee and lawyers who thought paperwork was a weapon. I'd learned to make my face a surface that told people exactly what I needed them to believe. Kevin would walk through that door expecting to find his mother, arthritic, medicated, quietly diminished by the conservatorship's year-long erosion of her world. A woman who'd stopped fighting. I would give him a version of that. Close enough to be convincing. I wouldn't be the victim. I wouldn't be the rambling wreck described in his court filings. I would be the broker closing the most important deal of her career. The commander was back. I returned to the foyer. The scattered truffles lay where I'd left them, the gold foil box on its side near the base of the entryway cabinet. I knelt again, my knees registered this as an act of aggression, and gathered each truffle with clinical precision, placing them back in their molded cups with the careful deliberateness of someone resetting a stage. The GPS tracker went back exactly where I'd found it, oriented the same direction, the status light still blinking its small green pulse. I smoothed the plastic liner flat, corner by corner, until there were no tells. I repositioned the faux velvet tray. I closed the lid and looped the gold ribbon back into the same bow, a bow Kevin had probably tied himself or had someone tie for him, the kind of bow that was meant to look like effort. It looked like a peace offering again. It looked like a son's love. It looked like the bait it had been designed to be, and I had handled it without springing the trap. Now I would set one of my own. I chose my chair, the wingback positioned in the corner of the living room, angled to catch the first wash of headlights through the front door's sidelights. From here I could see the bar, the recorder behind its amber decanter, the leather club chairs across the low table. I could see the entryway. I could see everything. I poured a glass of water from the carafe on the side table and held it with both hands, steadying the vibration, keeping the surface still, not because I was afraid of spilling but because the discipline of it settled something in my chest. My joints throbbed at their usual frequency, the low hum of damage accumulated over decades, but I'd learned to treat pain as information rather than emergency. It was telling me I was still here. Still functional. Outside, the desert wind moved through the creosote, and the saguaros stood their long shadows across the cooling earth. Then, the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. I took a slow sip of water. Set the glass down. Centered myself in the chair the way I used to center myself before walking into a room where millions of dollars were waiting to change hands, that particular stillness that was not passivity but coiled readiness, the stillness of a thing about to move. Kevin was here. I waited for the knock, my hands folded in my lap, the recorder blinking its red pulse behind $40,000 worth of crystal, and I arranged my face into the most dangerous expression in my repertoire. Patient. Open. Waiting to be underestimated. The front door swung open on a gust of late November heat, still in the high 80s out here, the desert's Thanksgiving gift, and with it came the smell of stale coffee and the particular frantic energy of a man who'd been rehearsing his entrance the entire drive over. Happy Thanksgiving Eve, Mom. Kevin's voice landed a pitch too high, the cheerfulness stretched thin as a drugstore gift bag. He filled the arched doorway with his stocky frame, wearing a blue polo shirt that had probably cost $300 and looked like he'd slept in it. His face was arranged into something approximating warmth, but his eyes, bloodshot, perpetually darting, didn't come to rest on me. They went immediately to the mahogany desk. Then to the floor. Then to the side table, where the gold-foiled chocolate box sat exactly as he'd sent it, exactly as I'd replaced it, gold ribbon looped just so. The breath that came out of him then was almost a whistle, a long, pressurized exhale of a man who had expected a different scene and couldn't quite believe his luck at finding this one. He looked like a man who'd narrowly missed stepping on a landmine, unaware he'd walked into a minefield instead. I watched his shoulders drop half an inch. I kept my face at the setting I'd chosen, patient, a little dull, a woman waiting to be told what to think. He crossed the room in 3 strides and I had half a second to brace myself before his arms came around me in what passed, from the outside, as a hug. I felt his frame against mine, softer than I remembered, the body of a man who'd been sedentary with stress, and I felt it trembling. Not with grief. Not with the awkward excess of a son who didn't know how to hold his mother. It was the trembling of adrenaline and purpose, and his hands were not still. One arm ostensibly around my shoulders. The other at my side, palm moving with the practiced efficiency of a TSA agent. Patting my tunic pockets. He was checking me. Feeling for the hard rectangle of a cell phone, the angular edge of anything he didn't want in this room tonight. I stayed limp. My gnarled hands rested against the wrinkled back of his polo shirt, and I made them useless, made my whole body an absence, the way I used to when I needed a room to underestimate me before I closed it. "You're so thin, Mom," he murmured into my hair. The smell of him was peppermint gum over nervous sweat, a combination more cloying than expensive chocolate. I recognized the peppermint. He'd chewed it compulsively since his 20s when he was anxious, a tell I'd catalogued years ago and never had cause to weaponize. I had cause now. He stepped back. And the face changed. It was a subtle thing, the shift, the way a professional mask settles over features when someone stops performing warmth and starts performing authority. I'd watched this transition happen across 100 conference tables, and I'd learned to read it the way you read weather on a clear day, the small pressures that precede the storm. "I signed the intent to sell today, Nora." He dropped the mom like a tool he'd finished using. His hand went to his back pocket and came out with a folded document, the paper soft at the creases the way contracts get when they've been handled repeatedly by anxious hands. "The medical bills, the ranch upkeep, the conservatorship can't sustain it." He spoke with the flat cadence of a man reciting from a prepared statement. "A developer out of California is clearing the lot for a resort. It's the right move." He talked about 300 acres of Sonoran desert, my father's survey lines, my husband's ashes scattered in the arroyo at the north edge, the saguaros that had been growing since before Kevin was born, the way you'd talk about unloading a used truck. "A pile of scrap metal." The phrase surfaced from somewhere in my chest, acidic and apt. I opened my mouth. What I intended to say was, "You don't have the standing. The conservatorship doesn't extend to the land trust." I checked, and so did my attorney, "And if you've signed anything it's worth exactly as much as your word, which is nothing." What emerged instead was a heaviness. My jaw felt wrong. Dense, uncooperative, like the muscles had been partially disconnected from the signal that should be driving them. I closed my mouth. Opened it again. My tongue felt enormous and sluggish in a way it hadn't 30 minutes ago. I pushed it aside. Stress response, I told myself. Cortisol. Breathe. The knock at the front door was sharp, rhythmic, official. Kevin didn't startle. That was the tell. When an unexpected knock comes, every person in the room orients toward it. There's an involuntary quality to the response, the animal instinct to assess new input. Kevin didn't orient. He rotated, smoothly, with the ease of a man who had been waiting for exactly this sound at exactly this time. He opened the door himself, which was my house and my door, and on the other side stood a woman in a sensible navy blazer, a clipboard tucked under her arm, her expression arranged in the particular blend of warmth and professional remove that I associated with social workers and oncologists. Adult Protective Services. "I'm here for the scheduled wellness check." Scheduled. My heart did something unpleasant. I hadn't been notified. The conservatorship order required advance notice of wellness visits. I'd read the paperwork with a magnifying glass because paperwork had been my native language for 3 decades, and I knew every line of what Kevin was and wasn't permitted to do. An unannounced APS visit required either an emergency petition or a son who'd called ahead and arranged it, and told the worker what to expect when she arrived. Kevin was already ushering her in with the practiced, sorrowful grace of a man burdened by love. "Thank you so much for coming," he said, and his voice had changed again, softer now, grateful, the voice of a devoted son holding a terrible situation together with both hands. "I'm really worried about her today." The shark had called in his witnesses. I tried to stand. "Hello," I said, or tried to say, and the word that emerged from my mouth was thick, wrong, a wet mumble that didn't sound like me. Didn't sound like Eleanor Vance, who had commanded rooms. Who had spoken into microphones at industry panels? Whose voice, 30 years of clients had told her, made you believe you were making the right decision even when you were terrified? What came out sounded like someone else's voice, borrowed and broken. My limbs had gone heavy. Not the familiar heaviness of arthritis. I knew that weight the way you know the weight of your own bones. But something different, something chemical and spreading, as though my blood had changed viscosity and my muscles were working against a new resistance. My knees didn't just ache. They failed, the structural reliability I'd relied on all evening suddenly gone, and I slumped back into the wingback chair with the gracelessness of a marionette whose strings had been cut. The APS worker's face moved through something. Concern. Recognition. Assessment. The word landed in the back of my fading mind like a stone in still water, and the ripples it made were cold. The water glass was still in my hand. I don't know exactly when I understood. The mind works strangely under sedation. The thinking slows but doesn't always stop, and sometimes the slowness creates a strange clarity, the way a river in low water reveals what the current usually hides. I looked down at the glass, and I saw it, a faint oily sheen on the surface, catching the amber light of the setting sun at an angle that wouldn't have been visible in ordinary circumstances. The water. I'd left the carafe on the side table when I went to the study for the recorder. I'd been gone 10 minutes, maybe 15. Long enough. Kevin hadn't come through the front door carrying a sedative. He'd come in advance. Either he'd been here earlier in the day while I was outside doing perimeter checks, or he'd had someone else come. Or he'd been more patient than I'd given him credit for, slipping in through the kitchen while I was at the windows watching the mountain shadows lengthen. He didn't need to prove I was incompetent for the next 30 years. He just needed to make me look the part for the next 30 minutes. The realization arrived fully formed, efficient, terrible. My own thirst had been the door he'd walked through. She's having one of her foggy days. Kevin's voice came to me as though through water, clear enough to parse, but with a quality of distance that told me the sedative was still spreading. He was crouching beside my chair, performing for the clipboard. His hand came up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture of such intimate, practiced tenderness that my stomach turned. It's the late-stage onset we discussed on the phone, officer. The neurologist flagged it last month. There was no neurologist. There had never been a neurologist. There had been Kevin, filing affidavits, and a court that moved faster than I could respond. It's getting harder to leave her alone, he added, sighing with the weight of a man carrying a cross. The APS worker's pen scratched against the clipboard. I heard every stroke of it. My hearing, at least, was still operating with full fidelity, the one sense the sedative hadn't managed to muffle. Tell her. Every remaining functioning circuit in my brain was firing toward the same objective. Tell her he's lying. Tell her about the gambling. Tell her about the land sale and the tracker and the chocolate box and the recorder behind the decanter. I'd done boardrooms on 2 hours of sleep and a bad ankle. I'd closed a $7 million deal with a fever of 102. I could do this. I could make my mouth work. What came out was a string of vowels, loose and disconnected, that bore no resemblance to language. I sounded exactly like the rambling, incompetent wreck described in Kevin's court filings. The APS worker nodded. Her pen moved. The last clear decision I made in those minutes was this: the recorder. If I couldn't speak for myself, evidence would have to speak for me. The recorder was running. It was capturing every word Kevin said, the fraudulent late-stage diagnosis, the name-dropped neurologist who didn't exist, the carefully arranged performance of filial devotion. I needed the APS worker to know it existed. I needed to point. I lifted my right arm. Or I tried to. The intention was clear as glass in my mind, but the signal lost integrity somewhere between the thought and the muscle, and what happened was that my hand rose approximately 6 inches above the armrest before it began to shake with a violence that had nothing to do with arthritis. This was the drug meeting my nervous system at a choke point and winning, turning my deliberate gesture into a symptom. The APS worker made a sound. A sigh. The particular quality of pity that people produce when they've already made their determination and the evidence is only confirming it. The tremors are getting worse, aren't they? She said, more to Kevin than to me. Her voice was kind. The kindness was the worst part. I let my arm drop. The bar was 6 feet away. The recorder was spinning behind $40,000 worth of crystal. And I couldn't cross the 6 feet, and I couldn't make my mouth produce the words, and the most important piece of evidence in my life was invisible to the only other person in the room. The worker closed her file. The sound it made, a flat, authoritative thwack, clipboard meeting folder, was one of the most final sounds I'd ever heard. I'd heard gavel strikes in courtrooms, the click of recording equipment going silent at the end of a deposition, the sound a phone makes when someone hangs up a call you needed them not to hang up. None of them had sounded quite like that. She stood. Straightened her blazer. Thank you for being so transparent, Kevin. She looked at me one last time, and her eyes contained the professional compassion you offer something you cannot help. A dying dog. A tree already fallen. Rest up, Mrs. Vance. Her shadow moved across the saltia tile in the amber light of the low sun, long and navy-jacketed and retreating, and the front door made its quiet, definitive click. The last witness to my sanity had come and gone. And she'd left a note on her clipboard that would follow me. The APS van hadn't cleared the end of the gravel drive before I heard the change in Kevin. The sound of a performance ending is subtle, a shift in posture, a relaxation of the held breath, but in the new silence of the living room I heard it in his footsteps. The soft, careful tread of the doting son became something heavier and more purposeful as he walked away from me toward the hallway. The utility closet door shrieked on its hinges. Metal on metal, the complaint of old hardware. Then the heavy, mechanical clunk of the main lever being thrown. The hum of the well pump, a sound so constant and low that I'd long since stopped consciously hearing it, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat, stopped. The silence it left was a different quality of silence than the desert quiet I'd lived with for 20 years. That silence was presence. This was absence. Then a sound I hadn't anticipated, a sharp metallic snap, the sound of something structural giving way under deliberate force. Not just switched off. Sheared. The handle, broken. Not reparable without a part one didn't have and a neighbor I was miles from. In the Sonoran Desert, without a functioning well, a house stops being a home in about 12 hours. The math was simple enough that even through the chemical fog I could run it. He came back through the living room without looking at me. His path took him to the corner where the router sat on its shelf, green lights blinking their small digital assurances. He crouched. His hand found the power cord. And he pulled it with the casual efficiency of someone unplugging a lamp they're tired of. The green lights died. I watched the darkness spread across the equipment and thought of the burner phone Melanie had smuggled to me a week ago, sitting in my nightstand drawer. Even if I could get to it, it needed signal to function, and signal came through towers and routers and the invisible infrastructure of connection that Kevin had just severed with a single pull of his wrist. The landline, I already knew. He'd have dealt with that before he arrived. Outside, the sun touched the top of the superstitions and the living room filled with the deep, suffocating orange of a desert sunset. Beautiful and merciless. The light turned the crystal decanters on the bar shelf into a row of amber fires, and behind one of them, a red LED I couldn't see from here was still pulsing. Still recording. I held that thought like a handhold on a sheer face. The drug was pulling me toward unconsciousness in slow, determined increments, and the room was cooling as the sun went, and I was alone in a house without water or signal or voice, with the man who had arranged all of it. He came back to me. Kevin crouched in front of my chair so that his face was level with mine, a deliberate choice, a power move disguised as attentiveness, the posture of someone managing something beneath them. Up close, his eyes were steadier than they'd been at the door. The frantic darting had stilled. He had what he'd come for, the APS note, the well pump disabled, my communications severed. A man no longer drowning. A man who believed he'd already made it to shore. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the side table. A small plastic bottle of water. Aquafina. Factory sealed, the safety ring intact. See, Mom, nothing in this one, with the cheerful deliberateness of someone making a point. Drink up, Mom. His voice was almost gentle. Almost. You're really not yourself today. His hand came to rest on mine, the right one, the one that couldn't feel much of anything anymore, the sedative having worked its way through the nerve pathways with chemical thoroughness. You should sleep. When you wake up, we'll be at the new facility. He said it the way you'd tell a child they were going to Disneyland. A fait accompli dressed as a kindness. Everything's arranged. He patted my hand once, twice. Then he stood, and his footsteps moved through the living room toward the front door, and the gravel drive received the sound of his car, and the sound of his car diminished, and the silence that was left in the ranch house was the silence of absolute isolation. No water, no signal, no voice, no witness, with the last light dying in the west and the desert going cold and dark outside the floor-to-ceiling glass. And behind a baccarat decanter of 12-year bourbon, a red LED was still pulsing. Still recording. I closed my eyes and made a list. I came back from the dark the way the desert comes back from a flash flood, slowly, then all at once. The room had gone completely black. No ambient light from the router, no glow from appliances. Kevin had been thorough, and for a long, disoriented moment I didn't know how much time had passed or whether the heaviness in my limbs was the drug or something worse. My head was a leaden thing, thumping with a slow, metronomic pain that sat behind my eyes and radiated outward with each heartbeat. My mouth was a desert wash, dry silt and copper, the particular taste of chemical intervention and dehydration working in concert. I tried to swallow. The mechanics of it failed me. 60 years old, I thought. Eleanor Vance. This is not where you die. The thought had no poetry in it. It was just true, the way the multiplication tables are true, the way property lines are true. I had not spent 30 years closing rooms full of men who wanted to see me fail in order to be finished off by a sedative in a wingback chair. I rolled. The impact with the saltillo tile sent a jolt of fire through my hip that was almost clarifying. Pain as information, pain as proof of continued existence. I lay there for a moment on the cool stone, breathing. The sedative was still present, a heavy shroud draped over my muscles, but the need for water had become something primal and non-negotiable, and beneath it, harder and colder and more sustaining, was something else. The need to finish what I'd started. I got my forearms under me and began to move. The hallway to the master bedroom stretched out like a bad dream. I crawled. There's no more dignified way to say it. Eleanor Vance, who had walked into every room of her life as though she owned it, because she usually did, crawled down her own hallway on her forearms and knees, her fingernails scraping at the Persian runners for purchase, dragging her unresponsive legs behind her with the grim determination of someone who has already decided that humiliation is information and not verdict. Every foot of distance was a negotiation. My body offered terms I didn't accept. My elbows made the terms I did. The drug had not touched my mind the way Kevin had intended. He'd miscalculated the dose, or underestimated the tolerance I'd built through years of prescription-strength anti-inflammatories, or simply failed to account for the particular stubbornness of a woman who had once closed escrow with a fever of 102. Whatever the reason, my thoughts were coming clearer with every minute of movement, the chemical fog thinning as my circulation worked. I reached the master bedroom door and pushed it open with my shoulder. The nightstand. I needed the nightstand. I pulled myself upright along the side of the bed, my arms doing the work my legs couldn't yet be trusted to do, and I reached behind the stack of vintage Architectural Digest issues I kept on the lower shelf, the August 2019 issue on top, the ones below it undisturbed for months, an accidental camouflage for the one thing I'd hidden there with Melanie's help. My fingers found cold, cheap plastic. The burner phone was exactly where it had been left. The screen opened to a low-resolution blue glow that hit my dark-adapted eyes like a flashbang. I squeezed them shut, then forced them back open. My thumb moved across the navigation key with agonizing imprecision. The drug had softened my fine motor control to the point where the simple act of scrolling through 4 contacts felt like defusing something. I missed the key twice. Hit it the wrong direction once. Melanie. I pressed call and held the cheap plastic to my ear. 1 ring. 2. Nora? Her voice came through in a frantic, thin whisper, compressed by the cheap speaker into something that sounded far away and frightened. Nora, are you? I'm here, I said, or something close to it. My voice was still not entirely mine, still thick with residual sedative and dehydration, but it was language. It was Eleanor Vance speaking. Talk fast. He's at the limit, Nora. She was somewhere with ambient noise, a car, maybe, the low rush of movement. The bookies in Vegas aren't waiting anymore. He's signing the land over to a shell company tonight to clear the debt. You have to get out. He's... Melanie. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress to anchor myself. He drugged me. The sharp intake of breath that came over the static was everything. I knew it. Her voice dropped lower, more intense. He's been telling everyone about your episodes. The whole story's already built, Nora. He's bringing a transport team at midnight. Private facility in Mesa. A pause, waited with something she was deciding whether to say. Once you're behind those doors with that conservatorship, it becomes a tomb, Nora. You understand me? There's no coming back from that. A tomb. He wasn't just selling the land. He was selling the land, disappearing me, and washing his gambling debt through a shell company, 3 crimes dressed up as a son's difficult decision about his ailing mother. I thought of the APS worker's clipboard. The note she'd written. The professional pity in her eyes. He'd staged the whole predicate. Call the police, I managed, the words scraping my throat. Tell them. The line went dead. I pulled the phone from my ear and stared at the screen. Midnight, not dropped, severed. The call timer showed the connection hadn't ended, the connection had been eliminated. I scrolled to 911, pressed call, and listened to the connecting icon spin in its mocking rotation, once, twice, before the signal bars disappeared entirely, replaced by a jagged red X that sat there in the center of the screen like a small, definitive door slamming. I tried again. The same X. I set the phone down on the mattress and sat with the information. The silence of the house pressed against my eardrums with a quality I hadn't noticed before, not the passive silence of the desert, which had texture and movement and the occasional skitter of something alive in the dark, but an active silence. A constructed silence. The silence of something that had been done to the air itself. Kevin had pulled the Wi-Fi. He'd sheared the well pump handle. He'd cut the landline before he'd arrived. And now this. I thought about the signal bars. About the way they'd vanished, not gradually, the way they do when you drive out of range, but instantly, there, and then gone, as though someone had thrown a switch. Because someone had. I understood at the moment the concept arrived, a portable signal jammer. The size of a hardback book, battery-powered, available on the internet for $300 to anyone who wanted to create a dead zone in a specific radius. I'd read about them years ago in the context of high-end security, the kind of privacy measures wealthy clients sometimes requested during sensitive negotiations. Kevin had learned the scorched earth policy from me. He'd learned it at the closing table when he was 19, watching me strip every point of leverage from the other side before they'd realized they'd given it up. I'd taught him that the most effective strategy wasn't to defeat your opponent, it was to eliminate their options until only the option you wanted remained. He was applying it to my existence. I was a mile from the nearest road. No water. No signal. A body still working through a sedative. A transport team arriving at midnight. And in the living room, a bourbon bottle he'd left me as a parting cruelty, knowing the combination of thirst and temptation and the drug's residual effect would be more efficient than a locked door. The locked door, he'd provided anyway. I sat in the dark of the master bedroom and took inventory the way I used to take inventory of a distressed property before deciding whether to walk away or make an offer. What assets, what liabilities, what leverage, what timeline. The recorder was still running in the living room. That was an asset. The bedroom door swung open. The wedge of yellow light that cut across the carpet reached almost to my knees, and in the doorframe stood Kevin's silhouette, stocky, slightly soft, the shape of a man who'd never had to earn his square footage. He didn't come in immediately. He stood there long enough to assess, the way you stand in the doorway of a room before you decide what it's worth. He didn't look angry. That was the part that chilled me. Anger would have been comprehensible. Anger is the emotion of someone who still sees you as a person capable of thwarting them. What Kevin's face held was something closer to disappointment, the specific disappointment of a manager whose subordinate hasn't followed procedure. In his hand was a small black box. The power indicator bled red into the hallway. Small and absolute. I thought we were past the secrets, Mom, he said. His voice was almost gentle. He walked into the room with the heavy, deliberate tread of someone who knows there's nothing to hurry for. I tried to push the burner phone under the duvet with my right hand, but my right hand was still negotiating with the sedative, and the movement I managed was slow, telegraphed, a slow-motion tragedy of intention outrunning capability. He reached down and pried the phone from my fingers. I tried to grip. I tried to dig my nails into the plastic casing the way I'd dug them into armrests and doorframes and the edges of 30 years' worth of impossible situations. My grip was a joke, pressure without purchase, the mechanics of a hand that had been systematically compromised. My nails barely grazed his sleeve. He sighed. The sound he made was long and condescending in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a resistance to exhaust itself. The sigh of a man who has already won and is now simply managing the aftermath. Melanie always was too soft for this family. He slipped the burner into his jacket pocket. His eyes moved over me with a quality of assessment that I recognized, the same way I'd look at a listing that had potential but required more work than the return justified. Don't worry. I'll handle her next. He looked at me not as his mother. He looked at me as a closing cost. I'm heading to the closing dinner now. He checked his watch, the Patek Philippe I'd given him for his 30th birthday, the watch that had cost me more than most people earned in a year, chosen because I believed he would become the kind of man who deserved it. He held the face toward the hallway light with the easy ownership of someone who'd never thought about what the watch cost anyone else. The transport team will be here by 1 a.m. They're very professional. He said this with the mild reassurance of a travel agent confirming an itinerary. You'll have a lovely view of a courtyard, I'm told. A courtyard. In Mesa. Behind coded doors with staff who spoke in the loud, bright tones reserved for the elderly and the very young, and a conservatorship that would look, from the outside, like a devoted son making an agonizing but necessary decision about his declining mother. He was booking my disappearance like a mid-tier hotel. He didn't see the flicker in my eyes. He wasn't looking for a person anymore. He was looking at an obstacle, one that had been, as of this evening, sufficiently cleared. He backed out of the room. His eyes stayed on mine the whole way to the door, not from wariness but from a kind of professional habit. You watch the room until you've left it, in case something shifts. His hand found the exterior handle of the heavy oak door. He drew it shut. The click of the brass key turning in the lock was one of the most complete sounds I had ever heard. Not loud, locks don't need to be loud. The authority is in the mechanism, the small, irrevocable engagement of metal with metal. A vault closing. A period at the end of a sentence. I heard him pull the key from the lock. His footsteps retreated down the hall with the steady confidence of a man who has secured everything that needed securing. "Oh, and Nora?" His voice came through the thick oak door, muffled but clear enough. "I left a fresh bottle of the small batch on the bar. The good one." A pause, calibrated. "For your nerves. Since the water's out, I figured you might want a nightcap to help the medicine finish its work." Silence. He knew I'd be parched. The sedative accelerated dehydration, and the well pump was sheared, and the sealed Aquafina bottle he'd left on the side table in the living room was the only moisture in the house, and the bourbon was the only alternative. He knew the temptation of amber liquid in a dry house, in a dry desert, after a chemical assault on the body's most basic needs. He knew my rituals. He'd grown up watching me pour a measure of bourbon at the end of difficult days, the glass held with both hands, the deliberate quality of the ritual. He'd turned my ritual into a weapon. A nightcap laced with whatever he'd put in the carafe, or perhaps just the bourbon itself, to ensure the transport team at 1 a.m. found me unconscious and cooperative. Either way, the bar was a trap built from his knowledge of who I was. His footsteps moved away from the door and down the hall. The front door was a sound I felt in my teeth, a deep, structural thump of old wood meeting the frame. Then the mechanical groan of the BMW's engine, the particular note of an engine being turned over by someone who accelerates before the car has fully warmed up, an impatience expressed in machinery. And then the gravel. The crunch of his tires on the long drive came through the walls and the floor and the window panes, and I tracked it, the sound diminishing in steady increments, moving north toward the road, growing thinner and more distant until it became indistinguishable from the desert wind moving through the creosote. And then nothing. The Arizona night had weight, out here. Real, pressing weight, the accumulated silence of a landscape that had been doing this long before any of us arrived and would keep doing it long after we were settled dust. The Superstition Mountains stood their dark silhouettes against a sky full of stars that nobody in a city ever got to see, and the desert held its breath, and Eleanor Vance sat on the edge of her bed in a locked room in a house without water. 60 years old. Drugged. Locked in. Dying of thirst. I sat with all of that. And then, the way the desert burns off fog in the first hour after dawn, not gradually, but in a clean, cellular shift, the sedative's grip on my mind loosened its last hold, and what was left underneath was not fear, and it was not despair. It was cold. It was clear. It was the particular mental state I had always moved into when the stakes were highest and the options were fewest, the commander's calculus, the broker's assessment, the 30-year professional habit of finding the one thing in a room that everybody else had missed. I had a brass bookend on the shelf above the nightstand. I had a locked door with a standard residential lock, not a deadbolt. I knew this house the way I knew my own knuckles. I had a recorder running in the living room that had been capturing everything Kevin said since before he'd arrived. I had an empty bourbon bottle on a bar that Kevin expected me to find irresistible. And Kevin, somewhere on his way to a closing dinner, had a phone that could receive calls. I sat in the dark and let the plan arrive the way good plans always did, not forced, not fabricated, but recognized. Already there. Waiting to be seen. I looked at the brass bookend. I started moving. I didn't scream. Screaming was for people who needed someone else to solve their problems, and there was no one within a mile of this house who wasn't either complicit or asleep. I'd spent 60 years not waiting to be rescued, and I wasn't going to start in the dark of my own locked bedroom. I reached for the brass bookend. It sat on the shelf above the nightstand where it had always sat, a 5-pound casting of a desert hawk, wings spread, talons forward, the kind of object that announces its own utility. I'd bought it at an estate sale in Sedona 15 years ago because it was beautiful and because heavy beautiful things are useful in ways that fragile beautiful things are not. I wrapped both hands around it, my gnarled fingers finding the best grip by feel, and I crawled to the door. My joints did not appreciate this. They registered their objections in ascending order of intensity, from the persistent background radiation of ordinary damage to the acute, white-hot spike of impact trauma as I worked my way across the floor. I categorized the pain and set it aside. Pain was information. It told me I was still here, still operational, still Eleanor Vance conducting the most important negotiation of her life. I positioned the head of the brass hawk against the wood frame just beside the latch housing. And I began to hammer. Each blow sent a shockwave up through my wrists and into my elbows that I felt in my back teeth. The sound was dry and rhythmic in the empty house. Crack, 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 the percussion of old wood fibers separating under repeated impact, and I counted the strikes the way I used to count the seconds of a held silence in a negotiation, letting the discomfort of it be the other party's problem. On the fifth strike, the wood gave a different sound, lower, more structural. On the eighth, I felt the frame shift. On the 10th, it surrendered. I wrenched the door open. The brass hawk was still in my hand. Good. I intended to keep it there. The hallway outside the master bedroom was dark and cool and smelled of the parched earth that crept in through every Arizona structure no matter what you sealed. My shoulder found the plaster wall and I used it as a guide, moving with the deliberate care of someone navigating by tactile information, the slight variations in the wallpaper's texture, the change in airflow where the hallway opened into the living room, the faint ghost of bourbon smell that grew stronger as I approached the bar. Kevin had expected the drug to keep me in that chair until 1 a.m. Kevin had expected the locked door to keep me in that room until 1 a.m. Kevin, for all his scorched earth preparation, had built his strategy on a foundation of underestimating Eleanor Vance, which was the same mistake people had been making since her first year in real estate when she was 28 years old and 4 male brokers had explained to her that the luxury market wasn't really a woman's space. The bar materialized out of the dark, granite counter and ranked crystal, the amber decanter catching the pale moonlight that came through the clerestory windows and throwing it back in scattered facets. I reached the counter and gripped its edge, steadying myself, letting my breathing settle from the exertion of the hallway. The recorder. First. My fingers found the back of the shelf by feel, the cool smoothness of crystal giving way to the textured plastic grip of the Olympus, exactly where I'd left it. I pulled it free and held it up in the thin moonlight filtering down from the clerestory. The red LED was still pulsing. Patient. Faithful. Still running after however many hours it had been since I'd pressed record in the amber afternoon. I hit play. Kevin's voice filled the dark living room. Signed the intent to sell. Clear. Unambiguous. The voice of a man who believed the only ears in the room belonged to an incapacitated woman who would be behind coded doors before sunrise. Clear she needs a higher level of supervised care. I listened to 30 seconds of it, the fraud, the fabricated neurologist, the practiced sorrow of a performance Kevin had probably rehearsed in his bathroom mirror, and then I stopped playback and stood there in the dark with the recorder held against my sternum. He had confessed to everything while standing 3 feet from the microphone. He had confessed while I sat drugged in my wingback chair, unable to stand or speak or point at the decanter where the evidence was accumulating, and he had never once looked at the bar with the awareness of someone checking their exposure. He'd forgotten who taught him to swim. I tucked the silver recorder into my waistband. The bourbon bottle was where he'd left it, center of the bar, positioned with the particular deliberateness of a gift that is also a threat. Small batch. The label I'd been buying since before Kevin was old enough to know what bourbon was. The seal was broken. He'd taken a pull from it before he left, steadying his nerves for the drive to the closing dinner, the way men like Kevin always reach for the nearest available comfort when they've just done something they can't quite make themselves look at directly. The level had dropped by roughly a measure and a half. I looked at the bottle for a moment. Then I looked at the gold-foiled chocolate box still sitting on the side table. The plan had arrived fully formed in the bedroom, the way good plans always did when I stopped trying to force them and let my 30 years of closing instinct do the work. What Kevin had built was a guilt structure. He knew what he'd put in the carafe. He knew he'd sent chocolates as a cover for a tracker. He knew his own exposure. And guilt structures, properly pressurized, collapse under the weight of the imagination faster than they collapse under the weight of fact. I didn't need poison. I needed his belief in poison. I unscrewed the cap. The scent of vanilla and oak and good American grain rose up in the moonlit dark, and I poured a measure down the bar drain to make room. My hands were not shaking from the drug anymore. They were shaking from adrenaline, the particular tremor of a predator that has found its angle. The truffles went in one by one. My gnarled fingers worked with a frantic, rhythmic precision that would have surprised anyone watching. Arthritis takes grip and delicacy, but it leaves urgency intact, and I was full of urgency. I unwrapped each truffle from its fluted paper cup and crushed it through the bottle's neck, dark ganache, 80% cacao, bitter and dense, then shook the bottle until the amber liquid turned the murky, sickly brown of something deeply wrong. I held it up to the moonlight. It looked like a desperate woman's final, clumsy cocktail. It looked, if you came to it with a guilty conscience and a pharmacology problem, like something that should not be consumed by anyone who wanted to keep living. Bitter like almonds, I said quietly to the empty room, trying the phrase for register. My voice was still rough, still carrying the sedative's residue in its texture, but the sentence landed with the weight I needed. I set the bottle back at center bar. The kitchen was at the end of the hall, and the phone on the kitchen wall was the one Kevin had forgotten. He'd pulled the router. He'd sheared the pump handle. He'd brought a signal jammer and pointed it at the digital age. But the landline in my kitchen was copper wire running through walls built in 1974, connecting to a physical junction that predated the internet and would outlast it, and it did not care about portable jammers or Wi-Fi routers or the assumptions of a 36-year-old man who'd grown up in a wireless world. The jammer had left with Kevin. I lifted the receiver. The dial tone was the most beautiful sound I'd heard since the recorder played back Kevin's voice. Steady. Patient. Waiting. I punched in his cell number from memory. I had memorized it the same week he'd changed it without telling me, 2 months after the conservatorship, because I'd recognized even then that there would come a moment when I needed to reach him and he would have preferred I couldn't. The call connected. Mom? His voice came through the SUV's Bluetooth in the clipped, mildly annoyed register of a man in the middle of something important. I could hear the engine noise, the slight quality of echo that speakerphone gives, the wind rush of desert highway. He sounded like a man moments away from a payday. I held the receiver close and did something I'd done perhaps twice in my entire professional life. I made myself small. I pulled my voice down into the register of a woman undone, thin, wandering, wet at the edges in the way that frightens people. 30 years of reading the room in reverse, I knew exactly what sound would reach through that Bluetooth speaker and grab Kevin Vance by the throat. Kevin. A long, labored breath. The chocolates, they tasted so bitter. A pause. Like almonds. Silence on the line. I let it sit. Let him fill it himself with whatever his guilty mind reached for first. I drank the bourbon, Kevin. My voice drifting now, disconnected, a woman floating away from the surface. To make the medicine go down. But my chest. I let my breathing go audible, ragged, effortful. It's tight. The hitch. That was the moment I knew I had him, the sound his breath made when it caught in his throat, the biological reflex of a man whose worst-case scenario just walked through the door wearing his own actions as its face. The telltale sign of a panicked gambler realizing the odds had shifted while he wasn't watching the table. What are you talking about, Nora? His voice had dropped, the annoyance replaced by something tighter. More controlled. The voice of someone trying to think through a problem that was accelerating past his ability to think. I let out a soft, dying sound that was almost a laugh. I dissolved the whole box, I said. The ones you sent. I thought it was a peace offering. I thought. A trailing pause. But it tastes like chemicals, Kevin. It tastes like your guilt. I heard the specific quality of silence that fills a car when the driver stops processing the road and starts processing something worse. Kevin knew what he'd put in the carafe. Kevin knew what a sedative overdose felt like in a woman who'd already been dosed. And Kevin's imagination, fueled by debt and desperation and the particular cognitive distortion of a man who has been lying for months, was now doing exactly the work I needed it to do. He believed it because he deserved to. I dropped the act. The way you drop a closing persona when the contract's signed and the other party has already committed, clean, complete, a switch thrown. My voice went from wandering to sharp in a single syllable. I found the recorder, Kevin. 3 seconds of silence. The one in the bar. Behind the baccarat decanter, the one you stood 3 feet from while you told the APS worker about my late-stage onset and the neurologist who doesn't exist. I let that land. It caught everything. Every word of your performance. Nora. I've already sent the file to Melanie's email. She's at the Phoenix PD right now. A lie, delivered with the flat authority of a broker reading from a title report. 30 years of moving difficult properties had taught me that the most effective lie is the one that fits perfectly into the space the other person has already hollowed out with their own fear. They're very interested in the shell company, Kevin. And the forged signatures on the intent to sell. The sound that came over the Bluetooth was the specific sound of a man realizing he is standing in a room with no exits. I waited 4 seconds. Then. Your tongue feels numb, doesn't it, Kevin? I kept my voice level, conversational, the tone I'd used to deliver the final terms on a deal the other party had no remaining leverage to refuse. You took a drink from that bottle before you left. I saw the level change. Over the phone, I heard the tires. A sharp, involuntary swerve, the sound of a body reacting before the mind had caught up, the wheel jerking when the hands went reflexive. He'd touched the bottle. He'd taken a pull. And now the machinery of his own guilt was running the calculation, checking his tongue, finding or inventing the numbness I'd suggested. His voice had climbed out of its controlled register entirely, stripping into something raw and high and frightened. I feel it. Nora, what did you do? What was in those chocolates? The placebo of terror is the most powerful drug in any pharmacopoeia. That depends, I said, on how much time you want to spend discussing it. I gave him exactly 10 seconds to sit with his own body. 10 seconds of listening to Kevin Vance take inventory of his tongue, his chest, his hands, checking each one for signs of the thing I had described, finding them, because the mind is an extraordinary instrument for confirming what it has been primed to find. Here's how this works, I said. You give me the code to your digital safe. And then you're going to tell me, clearly, and slowly, because this line is being recorded, about the gambling debts. About the shell company. About the forged signatures on the land sale documents. A pause. Or I let the timeline run. Nora, please. The code, Kevin. He cracked. The sound of it was not dramatic. It wasn't a collapse or a breakdown in the Hollywood sense. It was something quieter and more total, the sound of a structure that has been under unsustainable load for too long simply giving way. A man who had been performing competence through months of debt and fear and increasingly desperate fraud, running out of performance. He sobbed. And through the sobbing, he gave me the code. And then he gave me the rest. The names of the creditors. The Vegas bookies his lawyer had been negotiating with. The name of the shell company, a Nevada LLC registered 6 months ago, capitalized with funds he'd moved through my frozen accounts while the conservatorship paperwork was still being processed. The developer from California, and the side agreement that would have paid Kevin a finder's fee on top of the sale price. He gave me the forged signature admission last, the confession coming out of him in pieces, each piece loosening the next, the way a structural failure propagates once it starts. He'd had my signature on file from the conservatorship documents and he'd used it, carefully and once, on the intent to sell. I recorded every second. My hands had stopped shaking. The paramedics found his SUV pulled over on the shoulder of Route 60, hazard lights blinking in the pre-dawn dark, approximately 8 miles from the closing dinner he never reached. Kevin was not dying. His tongue was not numb. The bourbon had contained nothing but crushed chocolate truffles and guilt, it turned out, was enough. He was sitting in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and his forehead on his hands when the first responders arrived, and he told them, without prompting, that he needed to speak to someone. That he had done something. People who need to confess always find a way to do it, eventually. I'd simply accelerated the timeline. By morning, the audio file from the Olympus recorder had been reviewed by a detective from the Phoenix PD's Financial Crimes Unit, who described it, in the dry language of professional assessment, as remarkably comprehensive. Kevin's public defender would later argue that the recording had been obtained under duress. The recording itself would argue back. I didn't have a lawyer present for any of it. I didn't need one yet. The well pump took me 40 minutes and a pipe wrench from the toolbox under the kitchen sink. The handle Kevin had sheared was a standard lever assembly, the brake was clean, which meant it could be replaced with a replacement part from any hardware store, but what I had in front of me was not a replacement part problem, it was a jury-rig problem, and jury-rig problems were the kind I'd been solving since I was my father's daughter, watching him survey land in the Phoenix heat with whatever tools he'd brought in the truck. I found a section of copper pipe in the utility closet. I found a hose clamp. I found, in the bottom of the toolbox, a set of pliers with enough leverage to work as a second-hand grip. The grease got on my tunic. The grease got on my hands, working into the crevices of my knuckles and the swollen joints, staining the skin in the particular way that mechanical work stains you, permanently, or at least for a week. When the pump cycled back on, the hum of it moved through the walls of the house the way a heartbeat moves through a body. I stood at the kitchen sink and let the water run over my hands. Cold first, then warming. I stood there longer than I needed to. The sun came up over the superstitions at 6:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I was on the porch when it happened, sitting in the wooden chair I kept there for the purpose of watching this particular event. The mountains went from black silhouette to purple to the specific shade of rose gold that no photographer had ever quite captured, the light arriving in horizontal bars that turned the saguaros into standing copper. The desert doesn't lie. It just waits. My joints were in their full morning conversation with me, the accumulated insults of the previous 12 hours conducting a thorough debrief. I let them. They were telling me I was here, upright, on my own porch, watching my own dawn over my own land. The pain was an inventory of everything I'd done to keep it. I had a cup of coffee, real coffee, from the kitchen where the water was running, and I held it with both hands and watched the light move across 300 acres of creosote and saguaro and the particular kind of silence that means nothing has been lost. When the coffee was gone, I went inside and retrieved the brass bookend from where I'd set it on the bar. The Desert Hawk, wings spread, 5 pounds of solid casting, with a small dent on the leading edge of one wing from its work on the door frame. I also retrieved the sign. I'd bought it 2 years ago, when the conservatorship was first filed, and I'd understood clearly for the first time that someone was going to try to take this place from me. I'd had it made at a metal shop in Tempe, heavy-gauge aluminum, UV-resistant paint, the letters cut deep enough to still be legible in 10 years. Private property. No trespassing. Vance Ranch EST 1952. I walked to the edge of the dirt drive where it met the gravel, the place where Kevin's tire tracks were still pressed into the dust, and I drove the post into the parched earth with the brass hawk. Strike 1. Strike 2. Strike 3. The post went deep. The sign stood straight in the early light, legible from the road. I stepped back and looked at it. The morning air was cool, 55 degrees and dropping toward the day's first warmth, carrying the smell of creosote after a cold night, the smell I'd grown up with, the smell that meant home in a way nothing else ever had. The shark is gone. The desert is mine. I rubbed my knuckles, the old habitual gesture, and turned back toward the house. There was still coffee, and a recorder full of evidence, and a phone call to make to a real estate attorney I'd been saving for exactly this occasion. And there was the matter of 300 acres of ancestral land that needed, as it turned out, a new sign. The commander walked back across her own threshold in the early Arizona light, grease on her hands and steel in her eyes, and pulled the door shut behind her. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?